Thousands of people continue to take part in peaceful protests against police brutality and racism in the US. Huge crowds have gathered in cities and towns across the country. Large numbers of people are continuing to attend peaceful protests against police brutality and racism in the United States. Tens of thousands gathered in big cities, including Washington and New York, as well as small towns across the country. Earlier on Sunday, President Trump announced that the National Guard would begin withdrawing from Washington following days of unrest. Our correspondent Aleem Maqbool has this update from Washington.
Things have been extremely peaceful over recent days. You can barely see security forces visible here too. I mean, there was a sense that they were a bit of a red rag to a bull, particularly National Guard troops on the streets for a lot of the protesters. We now hear that they won't be used going forward, but still large numbers of people coming here to the White House and to protest around the country. And while the overarching cause, of course, Black Lives Matter against institutional racism and brutality by the police is the same everywhere, there are a lot of local causes being fought for as well, like in Colorado. People are fighting for justice for a particular family of an African American who was killed by local police there. And in other places, like in Virginia, there have been protests calling for Confederate statues to be removed. And in some cases, protesters have taken matters into their own hands, removing memorials to those who defended slavery or even fought to keep slavery. But in other cases, as with the authorities in Virginia, they've agreed to the demands of the protesters to remove more statues. So while that is still the case, while there are still tangible demands that can be met around the country, I think we're going to see these protests continue beyond the memorial to George Floyd tomorrow in Texas and beyond his funeral on Tuesday as well.
Aleem Maqbool in Washington. Well, Mitt Romney has become the first Republican senator to join the protests. He posted this picture on his Twitter page, wearing a mask and marching to the White House in protest against George Floyd's death at the hands of Minneapolis police, along with the words Black Lives Matter. President Trump, I should say, has sharply and repeatedly criticized demonstrations and called for state and local officials to crack down upon them.
Council members in Minneapolis pledged to dismantle the city's police force following the death in custody there of George Floyd. Thousands of people across Britain take part in more anti-racism protests. In Bristol, a statue of a 17th century slave trader is torn down and rolled into the river. Hello, we start with news that Minneapolis City Council has voted to dismantle its police department. Minneapolis is, of course, the city where 2 weeks ago the unarmed black man George Floyd died after a police officer knelt on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. That death triggered protests against racism and police brutality that have gone global. Significant reform or even defunding the Minneapolis police has emerged as a key demand of protesters in recent days. Over the weekend, the mayor of the city, Jacob Frey, was forced away from a rally after he would not commit to abolishing the police. Well, now 9 of Minneapolis Council's 13 members said they would create a new system of public safety, telling demonstrators the police department could not be fundamentally changed. Well, Miguel Otorola is a Minneapolis reporter for the Star Tribune. He was at Powderhorn Park in Minneapolis where the pledge was taken. Thanks very much for joining us. That pledge, we understand, was greeted with cheers and with approval from the crowd, and that's quite a significant change in the mood from what we've seen over the last couple of weeks.
Exactly. Thank you for having me. And I want to be very clear, too, that there has been no vote made yet. This is just a verbal pledge, a statement that was made in front of more than 1,000 people over at Powderhorn Park to say that they are committed to end the Minneapolis Police Department. It's definitely a sign of action based on the last couple of weeks of reaction that we've seen following the death of George Floyd.
So what could this mean for the police force in the city? What kind of future can people start imagining now?
We are just beginning that conversation. And in fact, I think within the city council itself, it's unclear what they mean by what it means to end the police department, what it means to have this reform that so many people are asking for right now. Already, the Minneapolis Police Department is under the investigation of the state for civil rights violations over the last 10 years. That is probably the most imminent thing that they are facing. And just on Friday, the city council had voted to go ahead and ban the use of chokeholds and neck restraints, to have police intervene if other officers are using too much force. So already you're beginning to see some wheels in motion, but this is likely going to be a process that takes months, if not more than a year.
I mean, Miguel, you mentioned you hinted at previous cases of police brutality against African Americans in Minneapolis. Why is it that previous attempts to reform the police department have failed?
That's a great question. And honestly, when I go out into the protests, it's one of the main things that I ask people that are out demonstrating. Why do you think that this feels so much different? There's so many factors to put into play, whether it's the pandemic, people being cooped up for so long, wanting to actually show their feelings, what they actually feel. There is maybe unemployment that has to go into that. But honestly, when I speak to Black protesters and African American protesters, they say they just feel that white people in the country, in the city, also woke up to them. And obviously, this is something that is much bigger than Minneapolis now. It's gone across the entire world, even in London.
Miguel, I wonder what we're going to see, what you expect to see then in your city over the next few days, now that this big announcement's been made, this big concession has been made, this key demand has been met. Are the protests going to fizzle out? Will they start focusing on another of their demands? It's hard to predict the future, but what's your sense of what could happen?
Exactly. To be honest, I do not think that this is going to be enough for the demonstrations to end. Do I believe that maybe the city council will start to take a little bit more time and start to put in more community input when it comes to their future decisions? Sure. I don't think there's going to be so many big decisions being made in the coming days, but the demonstrations are sure not to end. The feelings against the police department and towards the case of George Floyd's death and arrest and the charges and the case continue.
Miguel Otarola from the Minneapolis, from the Star Tribune, Minneapolis reporter for the Star Tribune. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you.
Well, Charles Wilson's a retired police officer and he's chairman of the National Association of Black Enforcement Officers. A little earlier, I asked him what he thought of the move by Minneapolis City Council to dismantle its police force.
My understanding is that they have not presented any clear-cut concepts of what it is they're going to put in its place yet, only that they are looking to, quote-unquote, dismantle what's there.
That's likely to be a long and complicated process. It could take some time. I want to talk a bit about your experience. You were the first black police chief in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, in the late 80s and the mid 1990s. What do you think it's like now for black police officers to be out on the streets dealing with protests where in many cases the police are the target of those protests?
It's hard. As black officers, we have to tread a very thin line. We know that we represent the quote-unquote police establishment by virtue of the job that we do. But we also have both a self-recognition and community recognition as being members of that black community. Of the 9,000 some odd members of our organization, most of them predominantly work in communities where they grew up and live in. So they know the community knows them, and they know that it's a need to work together to resolve the problems that people face.
You talked to our team and said that there's a dual consciousness of being both a black person and a police officer. What's it like carrying those two thoughts in your mind at once?
When I first went on the job, somebody asked me, what was I? Was I black police officer or was I a police officer who's black? And I very specifically told him I'm a very strong-minded black man who happens to wear the same uniform you do, and I'm watching you. It's hard being a black officer. There's no doubt whatsoever about it. But we consistently try to remember who we are, where we come from, and the reason we do the job we do. It's not for the fame and glory. It's not for the major overtime. It's to make a difference in the communities that we serve.
Well, the tearing down of that statue follows a fresh wave of demands in the US for the removal of statues representing figures who fought for the Confederates during the American Civil War. On Saturday, crowds in Richmond, Virginia tore down a statue of Confederate General William Carter Wickham, which stood outside the Virginia Commonwealth University. The destruction by protesters followed the decision by Virginia's Governor Ralph Northam to order the removal of a statue of the leading Confederate soldier Robert E. Lee from the state's capital. Well, let's get more on this from Ashley Lawrence Sanders. She's assistant professor at Dayton University and specialises in public memory and African American history. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks for joining us. Can you explain the link between these Black Lives Matter protests over the death of George Floyd and this resurgent demand to remove statues and other markers of history from the Confederate Civil War era?
Well, what we saw in the first wave of statue removals, it all began pretty much recently. I said all began, but the recent wave began in 2015 after the murders in Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Dylan Roof, the murderer, was associated with white supremacist causes, and he frequently used the Confederate flag in many of his pictures. That sped up the removal of the Confederate flag from the South Carolina State House, but also a questioning of the space of the legacy of the Confederacy in public spaces all throughout the South. So we saw eventually New Orleans remove several of their monuments, Memphis remove some of their monuments, Baltimore remove some of their monuments. A defense of the monuments coalesced in Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally, where Heather Heyer was killed because white nationalists and white supremacists gathered to protect that monument. So there's been a steady stream that had sort of trickled off. Municipalities had trickled off and backed off of these conversations a bit. But I always said that in addition to the massacre that happened in 2015, it was sort of the joining together of a lot of grassroots movements that had been put together on the ground by Black Lives Matter in the previous years to 2015, in 2014, 2015, local youth-led protests, Black-led protests joined with long-standing anti-monument sentiments to help begin this conversation again on why are these monuments up in the first place. And that's what we're seeing here right now. We're seeing the linking of racial violence against African Americans with the long-standing legacy of racial violence that these statues represent.
I mean, in Bristol, we saw that statue being torn down by a mob. I mean, they were a happy mob. They were quite pleased with what they were doing, and they have many supporters, but they also have many detractors, and also people who may well agree with the statue being taken down, but not happy with it being taken down in a lawless way. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think we need to be clear here that there had been processes before to try to take down this statue in Bristol and other statues through those sort of legal, bureaucratic, incrementalist processes of, trying to petition, trying to ask your local leaders. But we're seeing that these processes have not panned out. Many cities after 2015 in the United States created monument commissions to look at the monuments and statues in their cities. And I would say for a good chunk of them, the decision-making process was not in the hands of people in the community, particularly not from those communities that were harmed by these people. And the second thing is that these commissions did very little. In the case of Charleston, where the massacre happened in 2015, where this sort of wave began, no Confederate statue has come down. They had a commission. One of the output of the commission was to actually have a plaque, which I heard, which was a similar controversy in Bristol. They wanted a plaque to contextualize the statue of John C. Calhoun. They couldn't even agree on the language of the plaque. The language of the plaque was controversial. They couldn't vote on it. They watered it down. And there was a good chunk of Black council members who were also like, no, we should just take the statue down, period. So these incrementalist processes have not served the people who have been particularly harmed. What I overheard in that news segment just now, that young lady was saying is that if you are a Black person in Bristol, or if you're a Black person in Charleston or in Richmond or all these places, you have to walk by these statues every day. And on top of that, in the United States, at least, your taxpayer money, your public money that's supposed to be for everyone is going to maintain these statues. Millions of dollars has gone to maintain these statues and these monuments in these states over the years.